My name is Jane. I'm 32 years old, and I once believed that marrying into a powerful family would give me the security and status I had always craved. I thought my daughter Amanda's birthday party would be the moment when my husband's family would finally accept me. But instead, my husband John ordered me to wash his car in the middle of a raging storm to teach me my place. Cold rainwater sliced through my skin. Mud splattered across the white dress I had spent a week preparing, while the mocking laughter of relatives echoed from inside the warm house. When I became pregnant and begged for rest, he didn't just slap me. He grabbed my throat, roaring that I had betrayed the family by getting pregnant without permission. That night, as I lay on the cold floor with my aching belly, I realized a devastating truth. In their eyes, I was no longer a wife, a mother, but merely a tool for them to torment and satisfy their sick egos. And that was when I swore to myself I would never be silent again. If you were me, would you continue to endure to protect so-called family peace? Or would you stand up and fight to reclaim your dignity and future? Stay with me, because what I did next made that entire powerful dynasty tremble with fear. The Kennedy estate stretched across 50 acres of Virginia countryside, its colonial mansion rising like a monument to old money and older cruelties. Morning mist clung to the manicured lawns where I walked alone, my bare feet leaving prints in the dew-soaked grass. The house behind me hummed with the quiet efficiency of staff preparing for another day of maintaining the family's pristine facade. I had been Mrs. John Kennedy for 3 years, yet every morning felt like my first day as an unwelcome guest. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 7 times, its brass pendulum catching the light that filtered through stained glass windows depicting the family's coat of arms, a shield surrounded by Latin words I'd never been taught to read. Jane. The voice belonged to Margaret Kennedy, my mother-in-law, whose pearls clicked softly as she descended the marble staircase. Her gray hair was already perfectly coiffed, her navy dress pressed without a wrinkle. At 68, she moved with the calculated grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled intimidation. The breakfast table is set for family only. You'll eat in the kitchen with the staff. The familiar ache settled in my chest. Not surprise, but the dull throb of repeated rejection. I nodded, my fingers unconsciously smoothing my simple cotton dress, suddenly aware of how it paled against her silk elegance. The kitchen door swung shut behind me with a soft whoosh, separating me from the dining room where sunlight poured through crystal windows onto hand-painted china. Martha, the head housekeeper, set a plate before me without meeting my eyes. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee into a chipped mug, not the delicate porcelain used in the dining room. At 75, Martha had served this family longer than I had been alive, her silence purchased with loyalty and fear. "They're discussing the hospital board meeting," she whispered, glancing toward the dining room door. "Your name came up." Through the crack in the door, I could see John's profile as he cut his eggs Benedict with surgical precision. At 34, he possessed his family's sharp jawline and ice-blue eyes, features that had once made my heart race but now reminded me of winter mornings when warmth felt impossible to find. His brother Kennedy, yes, Kennedy, as the family's ego demanded, gestured with his fork, droplets of hollandaise sauce catching the light. "Jane's charity work reflects poorly on our reputation," Kennedy was saying, his voice carrying the entitled drawl of someone who had never been denied anything. "People are beginning to talk about her background." My background. The phrase they used to remind everyone that I had grown up in a trailer park in West Virginia, that my mother had cleaned houses to pay for my community college education, that I had worked 3 jobs to become a nurse before meeting John at the hospital where I treated his injuries from a car accident. I pressed my ear closer to the door, the cool wood against my cheek. "She's trying too hard to fit in." Margaret's voice carried years of practiced disdain. Yesterday, she suggested we donate to that shelter for abused women. Can you imagine? The publicity would be disastrous. The girl lacks discretion, came the gravelly voice of Grandfather Edward, the family patriarch at 89. Unlike the others, his words carried weight earned through decades of building the Kennedy fortune through real estate and political connections. But she serves a purpose. A purpose. I was 26 when I married John, believing his promises of partnership and love. Now, at 32, I understood that I had been selected like a piece of furniture, functional, unremarkable, easily replaced when worn out. The conversation shifted to stock prices and political donations, topics from which my opinions were neither sought nor welcome. I finished my breakfast in silence, tasting nothing, the coffee growing cold in my hands. Later that morning, I found myself in Amanda's nursery, watching my 3-year-old daughter play with wooden blocks. Her dark hair, John's hair, caught the sunlight streaming through lace curtains I had sewn myself during my first month in this house, back when I believed I could earn my place through small acts of domesticity. Amanda looked up at me with eyes that mirrored my own, brown and questioning, not the Kennedy blue that would have guaranteed her unconditional acceptance. "Mama sad?" she asked, her tiny hand reaching for my cheek. I forced a smile, the muscles in my face protesting the unfamiliar expression. "Mama's fine, sweetheart." Just thinking. But Amanda, with the intuition that only children possess, wasn't convinced. She climbed into my lap, her small body warm against mine, and whispered, "Daddy loud last night." My blood chilled. I had hoped she hadn't heard John's latest tirade, the one where he'd discovered I had written a check to my brother Liam's defense attorney. $200, a fraction of what the family spent on a single bottle of wine. But to John, it represented a betrayal of loyalty, a sign that I still cared about the people they considered beneath us. "Money leaves this family for one reason only," he had shouted, his face flushed with the kind of rage that made his veins stand out against his temples. "To increase our influence. Your trash brother doesn't qualify." Liam had been arrested on drug charges, a mistake that would cost him his job and possibly his freedom. The lawyer I'd found was overworked and underpaid, but he had promised to fight for Liam's future. John had discovered the check that morning and confronted me in the library, his voice echoing off walls lined with books none of them had ever read. "You will call the bank immediately and stop payment," he had demanded, standing so close I could smell his cologne, something expensive and overwhelming that always made me feel dizzy. "Then you will apologize to my family for this embarrassment." I had stared at him, this man I had once loved, wondering when his features had become so cold, when his touch had begun to feel like a claim of ownership rather than affection. "He's my brother, John. He made a mistake, but he's still family." "Hi!" The slap came without warning, sharp and precise, landing on my left cheek with enough force to snap my head to the side. The sting bloomed instantly, followed by the metallic taste of blood where my teeth had cut my inner lip. "Your family," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting, "is the Kennedy family." Everything else is past tense. Now, holding Amanda in the quiet of her nursery, I touched my cheek where a faint bruise had formed beneath carefully applied concealer. The makeup artist at the department store had been kind when I'd asked for something to cover a kitchen accident, her knowing eyes asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The afternoon stretched before me like a prison sentence. I had no friends to call. The Kennedy family had made it clear that my social circle should consist only of people who enhanced their reputation. I had no job to return to. John had insisted I quit nursing to focus on family responsibilities. I had no hobbies beyond the charity work they now wanted me to abandon. I was 26 when I became a Kennedy. At 32, I was disappearing. That evening, as I dressed for dinner in a navy dress Margaret had selected for me, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to John's grandmother. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, thinner than I remembered, with shadows under her eyes and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile naturally. My wedding ring, a massive diamond surrounded by smaller stones, felt heavy on my finger, its weight a constant reminder of the chains I had mistaken for jewelry. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Martha entered without waiting for permission, her arms full of fresh linens. "Mrs. Kennedy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something today while cleaning the library, something I think you should see." From beneath the linens, she produced a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore the initials MK. Margaret Kennedy, but not the current Margaret. This had belonged to John's grandmother, the first Mrs. Edward Kennedy, a woman whose portrait hung in the main hallway, but whose story had never been told in my presence. "She wrote about the family," Martha whispered, glancing toward the door, "about how they treated her, about what they're capable of." My hands trembled as I took the journal. The leather felt warm, as though it had been recently held by living hands. I opened to a random page, and Margaret Kennedy's careful script filled my vision. "Edward grows more controlling each day. He has forbidden me from visiting my sister, claiming that her husband's business dealings reflect poorly on our reputation. When I protested, he reminded me that everything I have belongs to him. My clothes, my jewelry, even the air I breathe in this house. I am not a wife, I realize now. I am a possession." The words hit me like physical blows. I flipped to another page. "The doctor confirmed my suspicions today. I am with child." Edward was pleased, of course, but only because it means the Kennedy line continues. He has already begun planning the child's future, as though the baby belongs to him alone. I am merely the vessel. "Mrs. Kennedy," Martha said urgently, "they can't know you have this. Mrs. Margaret, your mother-in-law, she destroyed all the other journals after the old Mr. Edward died. I saved this one, hid it all these years, waiting for someone who might understand." I looked up at Martha, seeing her clearly for the first time. Her lined face held decades of secrets, her eyes reflecting the weight of watching 3 generations of Kennedy women disappear into silence. "What happened to her?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "She died when John's father was 10 years old," Martha said. "Officially, it was a heart attack. But she was only 34, healthy as a horse. The night before she died, she told me she was planning to leave, to take her son and go to her sister in California." The room felt suddenly airless. I clutched the journal to my chest, feeling the weight of Margaret Kennedy's words, her pain, her desperate hope for escape. "They made her disappear," I whispered. Martha nodded. "And they'll do the same to you if you let them." That night, I lay in bed beside John, listening to his steady breathing while my mind raced through the implications of Margaret's journal. The leather binding pressed against my ribs where I had hidden it beneath my nightgown, its presence both comforting and terrifying. Outside our bedroom window, storm clouds gathered, throwing shadows across the moonlit grounds. John stirred beside me, his arm falling across my waist with the casual possessiveness that had once felt like protection. Now it felt like a trap. His wedding ring caught the faint light, white gold carved with the Kennedy crest, a symbol of ownership rather than love. I waited until his breathing deepened before sliding carefully from beneath his arm. The hardwood floor was cold against my bare feet as I padded to the bathroom, journal clutched against my chest. Under the harsh fluorescent light, I opened to where I had left off reading, Edward's brother came to dinner tonight, the one they call Senator Kennedy, though he holds no real office. He looked at me the way men look at horses at auction, evaluating breeding potential. During dessert, he asked Edward about my family contributions, as though I were livestock producing valuable offspring. Edward laughed and said I was performing adequately. I wanted to scream, to throw my wine glass at the wall, to run from this house and never return. Instead, I smiled and served coffee. My hands shook as I turned the page. Margaret's words from 70 years ago could have been written yesterday, describing my own suffocating existence with painful accuracy. I have been thinking about escape, not just for myself, but for my unborn child. What kind of life awaits a Kennedy heir? Will my son grow up to treat women the way his father and grandfather do? Will he learn that love is possession, that wives are commodities to be traded for social advantage? I cannot let that happen. I must find a way out. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. I quickly closed the journal and flushed the toilet, splashing cold water on my face to appear as though I had simply needed the bathroom. When I returned to bed, John was sitting up, his eyes reflecting the storm's lightning. "You're restless tonight," he said, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. "Bad dreams?" "The storm," I lied smoothly, settling back under the covers. "It's keeping me awake." He studied my face in the dim light, and for a moment I wondered if he could somehow sense the journal's presence, could smell the scent of rebellion that I felt sure must be radiating from my pores. But then he lay back down, pulling me against his chest with rough possessiveness. "Tomorrow we're having dinner with the Harrisons," he said into the darkness. "Margaret wants you to wear the blue dress, the one with the high neckline. And Jane—" His fingers found my chin, tilting my face toward his. "Smile more. You've been looking unhappy lately, and people are starting to notice." The next morning brought gray skies and the persistent scent of rain. I sat in the breakfast nook, still not permitted in the main dining room, picking at scrambled eggs while Amanda colored in a book beside me. Her chatter about cartoon characters and playground adventures felt like the only real conversation I'd had in months. "Mama, why don't we live in a little house?" she asked suddenly, looking up from her crayons. "Like Emma's family?" Emma was her friend from preschool, a girl whose mother drove a dented Honda and packed lunches in brown paper bags. I had met her briefly during pickup, and her easy smile and paint-stained jeans had made me ache with longing for simplicity. "We live here because it's Daddy's family house," I said carefully, aware that in the Kennedy household, even conversations with 3-year-olds could be scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. "But you're sad here," Amanda said with devastating accuracy. "Emma's mama laughs all the time." Before I could respond, Kennedy's voice boomed from the dining room. "Jane, get in here, now." The tone sent ice through my veins. I kissed Amanda's forehead and walked toward whatever new humiliation awaited me, the journal's weight a secret comfort against my ribs. Kennedy stood beside the dining table, holding a manila envelope that bore the letterhead of Hartwell and Associates, the law firm I had contacted about Liam's case. My blood turned to slush. "Imagine my surprise," Kennedy said, his voice deceptively calm, "when I opened the family's mail this morning and found correspondence addressed to my sister-in-law. Legal correspondence regarding criminal defense." John looked up from his newspaper, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to dangerous attention. Margaret set down her coffee cup with the delicate precision of someone preparing for battle. "I can explain," I began. "Can you?" Kennedy's smile was razor-sharp. "Can you explain why you're receiving letters from lawyers who specialize in defending drug dealers? Can you explain why you're discussing the Kennedy family's private affairs with strangers?" My mouth went dry. The letter was likely about Liam's case, possibly containing information about plea negotiations or court dates. I had given the lawyer our address because Liam had been staying with friends whose mailbox wasn't secure. "My brother isn't a drug dealer," I said quietly. "He made a mistake, but he's not a criminal." "Your brother," John said, standing slowly, "is exactly what we expected him to be when you brought your trailer park family into our lives. The question is whether you're the same." The words hit like physical blows. I thought of Liam, 24 years old and terrified, calling me from jail with tears in his voice. I thought of the lawyer who had agreed to take his case for a fraction of his usual fee because he believed in second chances. I thought of Margaret Kennedy's journal, hidden against my heart like a talisman. "I won't abandon my family," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Not for you, not for anyone." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's pearls clicked as she shifted in her chair. Kennedy's smile never wavered, but something deadly flickered behind his eyes. "John," he said softly, "I think your wife needs to be reminded of her priorities." What happened next occurred with the swift brutality of a snake strike. John crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand connecting with my cheek with enough force to send me stumbling backward. But unlike previous times, he didn't stop there. His other hand found my throat, fingers tightening with practiced precision. "You will call that lawyer," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "And you will tell him that the Kennedy family wants nothing to do with drug dealers or their representatives. You will cut all contact with your brother, and you will never again embarrass this family with your misguided loyalty." I couldn't breathe. Dark spots danced at the edges of my vision as his grip tightened. Through the dining room doorway, I could see Amanda in the breakfast nook, her small face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror. "John, that's enough." Grandfather Edward's voice cut through the violence with quiet authority. "Release her." John's fingers loosened, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The marble floor was cold and unforgiving beneath my palms as I struggled to catch my breath. "Violence is crude, John," Edward continued, his cane tapping against the floor as he approached. "There are more elegant ways to ensure compliance." The old man's shadow fell across me as I knelt at his feet. At 89, Edward Kennedy had the kind of presence that made rooms fall silent, the accumulated power of decades spent bending others to his will. "Stand up, child," he said, not unkindly. I rose on shaking legs, my hand instinctively moving to my throat where John's fingers had left marks. Edward studied me with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "You remind me of someone," he said thoughtfully. "My first wife, Margaret. She had your stubborn streak, your misguided sense of loyalty to people who didn't deserve it." My breath caught. Did he know about the journal? "Margaret learned, eventually, that marriage into this family requires certain sacrifices," he continued. "Personal relationships that conflict with family interests must be severed. Dreams that don't align with family goals must be abandoned. Independence must be surrendered in favor of unity. And if I refuse?" The words left my mouth before I could stop them. Edward's smile was thin as winter ice. "Then you'll discover what happened to the women who came before you, who made similar choices. My dear Margaret, for instance, thought she could leave us, thought she could take my son and disappear in the night." The room felt airless. What happened to her? "Heart failure," Edward said smoothly. "Tragic, really. She was so young, so healthy. The doctors were baffled. These things happen sometimes, especially to women who subject themselves to unnecessary stress. The threat was unmistakable." I looked around the room, at John, whose face showed no remorse for nearly strangling me, at Kennedy, who examined his manicured nails with bored indifference, at Margaret, whose expression remained perfectly neutral, as though watching domestic violence were as routine as morning coffee. "I understand," I whispered, but I was lying. What I understood was that I was trapped in a house full of predators, that my daughter was witnessing her father's brutality, that the gentle woman whose journal I carried had died for trying to escape the same cage that now held me. "Excellent," Edward said. "Now, about that lawyer." I called the law office from the phone in the library, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I told them I could no longer afford their services, that family circumstances had changed. The secretary was kind but professional, promising to send a final bill and case summary. As I hung up, I noticed a framed photograph on Edward's desk that I had never seen before. A young woman in a 1950s wedding dress, her smile radiant despite the sadness in her eyes. Margaret Kennedy, frozen in time at the moment when she still believed in happiness. "She was beautiful," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Martha in the doorway, her lined face creased with concern. She glanced around the empty library before stepping inside and closing the door. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her eyes lingering on the marks around my throat. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I heard what happened," Martha continued, "and I know what you're thinking. That you're trapped, that there's no way out. But there is." From her apron pocket, she withdrew a small silver key. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Richmond," she said, pressing the key into my palm. Margaret, the first Margaret, she wasn't as helpless as they thought. She kept records, documented everything. Names, dates, bank transactions, medical records, evidence. My heart hammered against my ribs. Evidence of what? "Of what this family really is," Martha said grimly, "and of what happened to the women who tried to cross them." Margaret wasn't the only one. There was Edward's second wife, Catherine, who died in a car accident after threatening divorce. John's first girlfriend, Sarah, who had a mysterious overdose after she became pregnant. 3 generations of women who knew too much and posed too great a threat. The key felt burning hot in my palm. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Because I watched them destroy Margaret, and I did nothing. I was young, scared, dependent on this family for my livelihood. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." She gripped my arm with surprising strength. "But I won't watch them destroy you too. Or your daughter." That night, after John had fallen into his usual bourbon-induced sleep, I sat in Amanda's nursery with Margaret's journal open on my lap. By lamplight, I read the final entries. "I have moved the evidence to a safe location. If something happens to me, if they succeed in silencing me, perhaps someday another woman will find it. Perhaps she will have the courage I lack to use it. Edward suspects I'm planning to leave. He watches me constantly now, has instructed the staff to report my activities. I feel like a prisoner in my own home, but I won't give up. My son deserves better than this family's legacy of cruelty. Tonight is the night. I have contacted my sister, arranged for transportation. By tomorrow, we will be free. If I succeed, I will return for the evidence. Use it to ensure we are never found. If I fail." The entry ended there. 2 days later, according to the dates, Margaret Kennedy was dead. I closed the journal and looked at my sleeping daughter. Amanda's face was peaceful in the soft lamplight, her small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit I had given her for her second birthday. She deserved better than to grow up watching her mother disappear into silence. better than to learn that love meant subjugation, better than to become another generation in the Kennedy cycle of abuse. The silver key felt warm in my pocket as I made my decision. I would not be another Margaret Kennedy, dying quietly with my secrets buried. I would not let Amanda learn that women existed to be controlled and discarded when they became inconvenient. I would fight back. The next morning brought unseasonable warmth and clear skies that seemed to mock my internal storm. At breakfast, the family discussed Kennedy's upcoming campaign for state attorney general, their voices bright with political ambition, while I sat silent at my designated place in the kitchen. But silence, I was learning, could be a weapon too. While they planned speeches and fundraisers, I was planning something else entirely. During my usual afternoon walk through Richmond, ostensibly for grocery shopping but actually to maintain the illusion of freedom, I would visit First National Bank. I would retrieve Margaret's evidence and discover exactly what secrets the Kennedy family had killed to protect. And then I would make my choice. Join the long line of women who had died keeping Kennedy secrets, or become the first to live by exposing them. The safety deposit box was smaller than I had imagined, barely larger than a shoebox, yet it contained enough evidence to destroy a family dynasty that had thrived on secrets for 3 generations. My hands trembled as I lifted out folders marked with Margaret's careful handwriting: financial records, medical documentation, personal correspondence, and most damning of all, insurance claims and death certificates. The bank's private viewing room felt suffocatingly small as I spread the documents across the metal table. Margaret Kennedy hadn't just been planning an escape. She had been building a legal case that would have exposed decades of systematic abuse, financial fraud, and quite possibly murder. The insurance records were particularly revealing. Catherine Kennedy, Edward's second wife, had died in 1967 when her car mysteriously veered off a cliff road in broad daylight. The police report cited mechanical failure, but Margaret had discovered that the car had been serviced by a Kennedy family friend just days before the accident. More suspicious still, Edward had purchased a life insurance policy on Catherine just 6 months earlier, a policy worth $2 million in today's money. Sarah Mitchell, John's college girlfriend, had died of a drug overdose in 1999, just weeks after telling friends she was pregnant with his child. The toxicology report showed levels of heroin that would have been fatal even to a seasoned addict, yet Sarah had never used drugs. Her death had cleared the way for John to marry his first wife, a senator's daughter whose political connections had launched his early career. And then there was Margaret herself, the first Mrs. Edward Kennedy, whose heart attack, at 34, had been preceded by 6 months of increasingly frequent doctor visits for mysterious symptoms: fatigue, nausea, hair loss, and intermittent paralysis. The medical records, which Margaret had somehow obtained, showed elevated levels of thallium in her blood tests, a poison once commonly used in rat killer and virtually undetectable without specific testing. I sat back in the hard plastic chair, feeling the weight of 3 women's deaths pressing down on me. The Kennedy family hadn't just destroyed lives through emotional abuse and control. They had literally murdered the women who threatened their carefully constructed empire. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Through the viewing room's small window, I could see the bank manager hovering anxiously in the hallway. I had been here for nearly 2 hours, and closing time approached. 5 more minutes, I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. At the bottom of Margaret's collection was a sealed envelope marked, "For the woman who comes after me." Inside, I found a letter written in the same careful script as the journal. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and I am no longer alive to protect my son or expose the truth about this family. You are likely in the same position I once occupied, trapped, terrified, and convinced that you have no options. But you do have a choice, one that I was too frightened to make." These documents represent years of careful investigation into the Kennedy family's crimes. Used properly, they could bring justice not only for those who came before us, but for those who might come after. The key to defeating them lies not in confrontation, but in exposure. They fear nothing more than public scrutiny, than having their carefully constructed reputation revealed as the facade it truly is. Use that fear. Be braver than I was. Be the voice that speaks when all others have been silenced. With hope for your courage, Margaret Kennedy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse alongside photocopies of the most damaging documents. The originals would remain here, safe in their metal tomb, but copies would come home with me. My insurance policy against a family that had perfected the art of making inconvenient women disappear. The drive home through Richmond's tree-lined streets felt surreal. Other families were gathering for dinner, children playing in front yards while mothers called them inside. Normal lives, unmarked by the shadow of generational violence that had become my reality. At the Kennedy estate, evening was settling over the grounds like a heavy blanket. I parked near the servants' entrance and slipped inside through the kitchen, hoping to avoid the family until I could process what I had learned. But as I climbed the back stairs toward Amanda's room, voices from the library stopped me cold. "Becoming a liability," Kennedy was saying, his tone sharp with frustration. "The lawyer she contacted about her brother has been asking questions about our family's charitable donations. Apparently, he's suspicious about why we suddenly withdrew support from domestic violence shelters." "Let him ask questions," came Edward's gravelly voice. "What can he prove?" "It's not about proof, grandfather. It's about perception. Jane's erratic behavior is drawing attention at exactly the wrong time. My campaign can't afford whispers about instability in the family." I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear every word. "Perhaps it's time for another heart attack." Margaret's voice joined the conversation, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "Jane has seemed increasingly unstable since her pregnancy. Postpartum depression can be so tragic when it leads to self-harm." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. They weren't just threatening me. They were actively planning my murder, discussing it as calmly as a business transaction. "Too soon after the last incident," Edward said thoughtfully. "People might begin to notice a pattern." "What about an accident? Something that appears completely random?" "A car accident worked well for Catherine," Kennedy mused, "though we'd need to be careful about the timing. Close to the election, it might generate too much sympathy press. Or," John's voice entered the conversation, and my heart shattered completely. "We could arrange something that looks like domestic violence from her brother's criminal associates. His drug connections would provide perfect cover. A home invasion gone wrong, perhaps. Very tragic, but it would actually help Kennedy's Tough on Crime campaign platform. They discuss my death with the same clinical detachment they might use to plan a dinner party." I realized with crystal clarity that I had perhaps days, maybe hours, before they acted on their plans. Clutching Margaret's evidence to my chest, I crept toward Amanda's room. My daughter was asleep, her face peaceful in the dim nightlight's glow. I kissed her forehead gently, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo, memorizing the soft curve of her cheek against my lips. If I was going to die, it wouldn't be as another silent Kennedy wife. It would be as a woman who fought back. The next morning, I woke before dawn with absolute clarity about what needed to be done. While the family slept, I made 3 phone calls from the landline in the kitchen, knowing they monitored my cell phone. The first was to Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who had written exposés on political corruption. Her voice was sharp with interest when I mentioned the Kennedy family name and promised documentary evidence of criminal activity. The second call was to Detective Sarah Chen at Richmond PD, whom I had met during my nursing days when domestic violence victims came through the ER. Sarah had given me her card years ago, saying to call if I ever needed help. Now I needed it more than ever. The third call was to my brother Liam, still awaiting trial in the county jail. His voice broke when I told him I loved him, and that whatever happened, he should know I had tried to fight for our family. By 7 a.m., copies of Margaret's evidence were in a safety deposit box at a different bank, with instructions that they be released to the media in the event of my death or disappearance. Another set had been mailed to Detective Chen, along with a detailed letter explaining my fears about the Kennedy family's plans for me. When John came down for breakfast, he found me sitting at the dining room table, not in the kitchen, but in the main dining room, in Margaret's chair at the foot of the table. I wore the white dress I had been married in, now 6 years old and slightly tight, but still beautiful. My hair was pinned up the way Margaret had worn hers in the photograph on Edward's desk. "What are you doing?" John demanded, his face flushing red with anger. "You know you're not allowed in here." "I'm having breakfast with my husband," I said calmly, sipping coffee from the delicate china cup that had never before touched my lips. "Isn't that what wives do?" Kennedy appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm when he saw my deliberate placement and formal attire. Behind him, Margaret's pearls clicked as she hurried to assess this unprecedented challenge to their established order. "Jane, dear," Margaret said with false sweetness, "you seem confused. Perhaps you should return to your room and rest." "I'm not confused," I replied, setting down my coffee cup with steady hands. "In fact, I've never been clearer about anything in my life. I know exactly who this family is, and more importantly, I know exactly who I am." Edward entered the room, his cane tapping against the marble floor with the rhythm of a death march. At 89, he had seen 3 wives die in this house, had orchestrated their deaths with the patience of a man who understood that time was always on his side. But not today. "My dear child," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "You seem distressed. Perhaps we should call Dr. Morrison to examine you. Sometimes women in your condition suffer from episodes." "What condition is that, Edward?" I asked, using his first name deliberately, watching his pale eyes flash with rage at the presumption. The condition of being tired of lies? The condition of refusing to disappear quietly? Or perhaps the condition of reading my predecessor's journal? The silence that fell over the room was deafening. John's face went white. Kennedy's hand moved instinctively toward his phone. Margaret's pearls stopped clicking as she froze in place, but Edward simply smiled. "I see. And what exactly do you think you've learned from those old papers?" From my purse, I withdrew Margaret's journal and placed it in the center of the table like a weapon. "I've learned that Margaret Kennedy documented 3 generations of murder, fraud, and systematic abuse. I've learned that she gathered evidence that could destroy this family's reputation and send several of you to prison. And I've learned that she wasn't the only one." I opened the journal to a page I had marked with a ribbon. Catherine Kennedy, 1967. Sarah Mitchell, 1999. Both women who threatened to expose Kennedy family secrets. Both women who died under suspicious circumstances. Both women whose deaths benefited this family financially and politically. John lunged across the table, reaching for the journal, but I was faster. Years of nursing had given me quick reflexes and the ability to think clearly under pressure. "Looking for this?" I held up a folder of photocopied documents. "These are copies, John. The originals are safely stored somewhere you'll never find them. And if anything happens to me, anything at all, they'll be released to every major news outlet in Virginia." "You're bluffing," Kennedy said, but his voice lacked conviction. I smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a real smile, one that came from a place of power rather than performance. Am I? Rebecca Martinez at the Richmond Times-Dispatch seemed very interested in my story. Detective Sarah Chen at Richmond PD was fascinated by the insurance records and toxicology reports. And my lawyer, yes, I have a new lawyer now, has instructions to release everything if I die mysteriously or disappear. Edward's face had taken on a grayish pallor. What do you want? I want to live, I said simply. I want to raise my daughter without fear. I want to visit my brother and help him through his legal troubles. I want to be treated like a human being rather than a possession. And if we refuse? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, smoothing my white dress. Then you'll discover what it feels like to have your carefully constructed world destroyed by an inconvenient woman who refused to die quietly. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. What are your terms? We negotiated like diplomats ending a war. I would remain married to John, but the physical abuse would end immediately. I would be treated as an equal member of the family, with access to all areas of the house and participation in family decisions. My relationship with my brother would be restored, with the family's financial support for his legal defense. Most importantly, Amanda would be raised with love rather than control, free from the toxic patterns that had defined Kennedy family relationships for generations. In exchange, Margaret's evidence would remain sealed as long as the family honored our agreement. But any violation, any return to their old patterns of abuse and manipulation, would trigger the immediate release of all documents to law enforcement and the media. As I walked out of that dining room, still wearing my wedding dress like armor, I felt Margaret Kennedy's presence beside me. The first Mrs. Edward Kennedy, who had died trying to protect her son from his family's poison, would finally have her justice. That evening, I sat in Amanda's nursery, reading her a bedtime story while she curled against my side. For the first time in months, she seemed relaxed, no longer flinching when footsteps approached the door, or when voices were raised in other parts of the house. "Mama happy now?" she asked, looking up at me with those wise brown eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, meaning it for the first time in years. "Mama is happy now." Through the window, I could see John walking in the garden, his shoulders bent with the weight of a man who had finally confronted the monster he had become. Whether he would truly change remained to be seen, but for now, the immediate threat was over. Martha knocked softly on the door, entering with fresh linens and something else, a small wrapped package. "I found this among Margaret's things," she said, placing the package in my hands. She wanted it to go to the woman who came after her. Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with words in Latin, Veritas vincit, truth conquers. I opened it to find a tiny photograph of a young woman in a 1920s wedding dress, and another of a little girl with serious eyes. Margaret's mother and grandmother, perhaps, other women who had faced impossible choices and found the courage to survive. I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of their legacy and their strength. I was no longer just Jane, the woman who had married into the Kennedy family hoping for security and love. I was the woman who had stood up to 3 generations of abusers and lived to tell about it. As I tucked Amanda into her bed, she reached up to touch the locket. "Pretty, Mama." "It belonged to a very brave woman," I told her. "Someday, when you're older, I'll tell you her story." "Was she strong like you?" Amanda asked. I smiled, kissing her forehead. "She was strong like us." 3 months later, I sat on the front porch of the Kennedy estate, watching Amanda play in the garden where 3 generations of women before me had walked in silence and fear. The morning sun warmed my face as I opened a letter from my brother Liam. His charges had been reduced to misdemeanors thanks to the new legal team the Kennedy family had provided, and he would be home by Christmas. John approached from the direction of the stables, carrying a cup of coffee that he offered to me without the possessiveness that had once characterized his every gesture. We had a long way to go in rebuilding our marriage, and some days I wondered if it was possible at all. But for now, we were trying to learn what partnership looked like after years of power and control. "The reporter called again," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "She wants to do a follow-up story about political families and domestic violence." I nodded, sipping the coffee that tasted different now that it came from willing hands rather than fearful ones. Rebecca Martinez's original exposé about the Kennedy family's history had caused a sensation, forcing Kennedy to withdraw from the Attorney General race and prompting a federal investigation into several suspicious deaths. The evidence Margaret had so carefully preserved had finally served its purpose. "Are you going to talk to her?" John asked. I considered the question, watching Amanda chase butterflies through the roses we had planted together. "Yes, I think I will." Other women need to hear this story. They need to know that even when the situation seems hopeless, even when you're trapped by wealth and power and social expectations, you still have choices. Edward had passed away quietly in his sleep 2 weeks after our confrontation, taking his secrets to the grave. The official cause was heart failure, but I suspected it was something more fundamental. The death of a man whose entire identity had been built on control, who couldn't survive in a world where his victims fought back. Margaret, my mother-in-law, had surprised everyone by selling her jewelry collection and donating the proceeds to domestic violence shelters across Virginia. She rarely spoke now, but when she did, it was with a kind of wonder, as though she were discovering her own voice after decades of echoing her father-in-law's words. As for me, I had started a foundation using Margaret Kennedy's evidence and story to help other women trapped in powerful families document abuse and escape safely. We called it Veritas House, Truth House, and our motto was simple: every woman deserves to be heard. The locket around my neck caught the morning light as I stood to join Amanda in the garden. 4 generations of women now: Margaret's mother, Margaret herself, me and Amanda, each one building on the courage of those who came before. I look directly at you now, knowing that somewhere, someone is watching this story and recognizing herself in my words. Maybe you're sitting in a beautiful house that feels like a prison. Maybe you're wearing expensive clothes that feel like costumes. Maybe you're surrounded by people who call themselves family but treat you like property. If that's you, I want you to know something. You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not trapped, even when it feels like the walls are closing in. Every woman who has ever lived in fear and chosen courage instead has paved the way for you to do the same. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your life matters more than their reputation, more than their money, more than their threats. The truth has power, but only if you're brave enough to speak it. What will you choose? Will you disappear quietly into the shadows, becoming another cautionary tale whispered in the dark? Or will you stand up, speak out, and become the woman who breaks the cycle? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. But remember, you're not alone. Women like Margaret Kennedy, like me, like thousands of others who have walked this path before you, are standing with you in spirit. We are proof that survival is possible, that justice can prevail, and that even the most powerful families can be brought down by one woman who refuses to be silenced. Find your voice. Use it. The world is listening.